Imagine two nations separated by thousands of miles, yet locked in a struggle that has lasted for decades. One is the world's most powerful superpower, the other sits on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. There are no official declarations of war, no traditional battlefields, and no clear front lines. Yet sanctions, military pressure, political interference, and global accusations dominate international headlines. This is not a sudden clash driven by a long-standing conflict between the US and Venezuela, shaped by ideology, economics, and power. To understand why tensions between the United States and Venezuela continue to rise, one must look beyond recent developments and examine the deeper historical, political, and economic forces that have driven this confrontation from its origins to the present day. Only by tracing this long trajectory can the current crisis be understood in its full complexity. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela maintained relatively stable and cooperative relations with the United States. During this period, Venezuela emerged as one of Washington's most reliable oil suppliers, playing a crucial role in meeting America's growing energy demands. U.S. oil companies invested heavily in Venezuela's petroleum sector, and economic ties between the two nations deepened steadily. Politically, Venezuela was often viewed as a democratic and stable partner in a region marked by coups, authoritarian regimes, and Cold War rivalries. While disagreements existed, the overall relationship was pragmatic and mutually beneficial. Oil revenues fueled Venezuela's economy, while the United States enjoyed secure access to energy resources. This long-standing relationship began to change dramatically at the end of the 1990s with the rise of Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who won the presidency in 1998. Chavez represented a radical departure from previous Venezuelan leadership. He openly criticized neoliberal economic policies, condemned U.S. influence in Latin America, and framed his political movement as a struggle against imperialism. Chavez promoted what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, a project centered on socialism, state control of natural resources, wealth redistribution, and expanded social welfare programs. One of his most controversial actions was the nationalization of key industries, including oil, which significantly reduced the role of foreign corporations. At the same time, Venezuela strengthened diplomatic and economic ties with countries critical of U.S. foreign policy, such as Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran. These developments marked the beginning of sustained tension between Washington and Caracas. While the United States framed its concerns around democracy, economic freedom, and the rule of law, the Venezuelan government accused Washington of imperialism, economic exploitation, and interference in sovereign affairs. Mutual distrust became entrenched, and cooperation steadily eroded. Following Hugo Chávez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro, his chosen successor, assumed power. Maduro inherited a country facing serious structural challenges. Venezuela's economy was overwhelmingly dependent on oil exports, and when global oil prices fell sharply in the mid-2010s, the consequences were devastating. Unlike Chávez, who benefited from high oil prices during much of his presidency, Maduro faced shrinking revenues, rising inflation, and growing public dissatisfaction. Economic mismanagement, currency controls, and declining production led to shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods. Hyperinflation eroded savings, and millions of Venezuelans were pushed into poverty. As conditions worsened, political unrest intensified. Protests became more frequent, and the government responded with increasingly authoritarian measures. Elections were widely criticized by international observers, and opposition leaders were arrested or sidelined. The United States, along with several allies, accused Maduro's government of corruption, human rights violations, and undermining democratic institutions. In response, Washington imposed a series of economic sanctions aimed at pressuring the Venezuelan leadership. These sanctions targeted senior officials, financial institutions, and most importantly, Venezuela's oil industry, the backbone of the national economy. The stated goal was to force political reform and encourage a transition toward democratic governance. The Venezuelan government, however, rejected this narrative. It argued that sanctions amounted to economic warfare, deliberately worsening the suffering of ordinary citizens in order to destabilize the state and force regime change. This disagreement over the legitimacy and impact of sanctions further deepened the divide between the two countries. Tensions reached a critical point in 2019 following Venezuela's disputed presidential election. The United States recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó, then head of the National Assembly, as Venezuela's legitimate interim president. This move effectively declared Nicolas Maduro illegitimate in the eyes of Washington and many of its allies. The decision triggered a complete breakdown in diplomatic relations. While several Western and Latin American countries supported the U.S. position, others, including Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba, continued to recognize Maduro as Venezuela's lawful president. The country became a battleground for competing international alliances, reflecting broader global divisions. Internally, the recognition of Guaidó deepened Venezuela's political crisis. Competing claims to legitimacy paralyzed state institutions and heightened social tension. Despite international backing, Guaidó was unable to assume actual control of the government, leaving Venezuela in a prolonged state of political uncertainty. Throughout the early 2020s, the United States intensified its pressure on Venezuela. Sanctions expanded, Venezuela's access to international markets was further restricted, and billions of dollars in foreign assets were frozen. Oil exports declined sharply, further weakening the economy. At the same time, the United States increased its military presence in the Caribbean region. Officially, these deployments were linked to counter-narcotics operations and regional security concerns. American officials accused Venezuelan leaders of involvement in international drug trafficking networks and described parts of the Venezuelan state as criminal organizations. These accusations justified stronger enforcement actions, including the interception of vessels, monitoring of trade routes, and cooperation with regional allies. From Washington's perspective, these measures were necessary to combat crime and protect U.S. national security. From Venezuela's perspective, however, such actions were viewed as steps toward direct intervention. The government repeatedly warned that U.S. policies threatened national sovereignty and could destabilize the entire region. Trust between the two governments reached its lowest point in decades. In recent years, the conflict has entered a more dangerous and unpredictable phase. Military operations near Venezuelan territory, seizures of oil shipments, and reports of direct confrontations have raised fears of open conflict. Each incident has sparked international debate over legality, proportionality, and the limits of state power. At the same time, Venezuela has deepened ties with rival global powers, seeking economic and military support to counter U.S. pressure. This alignment has further complicated the situation, transforming what was once a bilateral dispute into a broader geopolitical issue involving energy security, global alliances, and competing visions of international order. What began as a disagreement over domestic governance has evolved into a symbol of wider struggles over influence in the Western Hemisphere. Three major factors continue to drive the U.S. Venezuela conflict. First, oil and economic control remain central. Venezuela's vast oil reserves represent both economic power and strategic leverage. Control over energy resources has long shaped international relations, and Venezuela's resistance to U.S. economic influence remains a core issue. Second, ideological differences play a major role. The United States promotes liberal democracy, market-based economics, and Western political norms. Venezuela's leadership embraces a socialist model that explicitly rejects Western dominance. This ideological clash has fueled mistrust, hardened rhetoric, and reduced opportunities for compromise. Third, geopolitical competition has intensified tensions. Venezuela's alliances with U.S. rivals place it at the center of broader global rivalries. As great power competition increases worldwide, Venezuela has become a strategic node in these larger struggles. The ongoing conflict has had severe consequences. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country due to economic collapse, political repression, and insecurity. Neighboring countries have struggled to absorb large numbers of migrants, creating regional humanitarian challenges. Global oil markets have also felt the impact of reduced Venezuelan production, contributing to energy volatility. Meanwhile, international reactions remain deeply divided. Some governments support U.S. efforts to pressure the Maduro administration, viewing them as necessary to uphold democratic norms. Others condemn these actions as violations of international law and national sovereignty. Human rights organizations warn that continued escalation risks worsening humanitarian conditions and could lead to long-term instability across Latin America. The conflict between the United States and Venezuela is not the result of a single event or policy decision. It is the outcome of decades of political tension, economic rivalry, ideological opposition, and strategic competition. What began as a dispute over resources and governance has evolved into one of the most complex geopolitical confrontations in the Western Hemisphere. Whether this conflict will move toward negotiation and resolution or further escalation remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that its consequences extend far beyond the borders of either country, shaping regional stability and global politics. The question remains, is this conflict a justified effort to promote accountability and democracy, or has it become an example of power politics overriding national sovereignty? The answer, as always, depends on perspective, and the world continues to watch closely. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more global news updates.